Centers. Erica, why don't I see you? Erica, I don't see you listed here. I'm going to mute you. Okay, I don't. This is not good. You're going to come over here. Let me mute you. Okay, hold on. Okay, everyone, I'm sorry we had a little glitch here. We're going to get rocking and rolling. I'm going to take down the pretest on the count of 3. So when we do, you're going to see my screen, which is awesome. But anyway, so 1, 2, 3. I'm going to take the test down. Close it. Okay, and now you should be able to see my screen. Can you chat in if you can see it? Yes, okay.
It says the session's already running. You can only have one session running. Oh, I see.
Okay, hold on. We're having a little audio glitch here. Thank you. No, thank you all. Yeah, I like this. I like to remember that I would prefer it to say that fix another person's crown without letting the world know it was crooked, but that is just me. Okay, Erica's going to be on in a second. Are there any, what would you want?
I just wanted to ask them to hold it, questions until the very end, and you'll be.
Okay. What I want to do for y'all is to let you know to hold your questions to the very end. I'm going to take them all down. Erica's going to present in the last 15 minutes or so. She is going to take the questions. Again, if you have problems with the audio or the visual today, because I know we experienced some, and we're experiencing some right now. This is being recorded and you'll be able to see it on TAASA's YouTube channel in about 10 business days. You can't get on? Okay, Erica can't get on. So good thing we're here. Hold on a second. Let me see what I can do. All right. Okay, hold on. All right. No. Okay, hold on. Erica, would you have your I have put it out here.
I think I'm getting it now. There we go. Yep.
Okay, now you're in. Okay. Dave, we're in. We're rocking and rolling. I'm making Erica the presenter, and then I'm getting out of here. Okay. All right. If I can. One more time. Okay, folks, I don't understand what's going on, but I can't recognize Erica, so we're changing computers very quickly. Please stand by. Okay. Come on.
You can use my computer if you want to look at it.
It's fine. Where is it? Okay, everybody should be able to see the supporting incarcerated survivors screen. Please say yes. Yes, great. All right, Erica, take it away.
I'm so sorry. Thank you so much, Wendy, for helping. Oh my goodness. And for everybody that's been waiting patiently on this for this webinar to start. So thank you so much for joining. I'm going to go ahead and just jump right in. My name is Erica Gamble. I am the prisoner advocate for the Incarcerated Survivor Advocacy Program at the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault. And we are launching 3 PREA-focused webinars for advocates, coalition staff, and others in the community who are interested in working with incarcerated survivors or who are already providing supportive services to incarcerated survivors and want to learn more. And so we'll have today's part 1, next week we'll have part 2, and the following week we'll have part 3. And I really encourage you all, if you are able to attend all 3 of them, as the information obviously supports one another. These will be available on our YouTube station afterwards, and so you'll have access to them even if you aren't able to attend next week or the week after. The last thing I'll say is that we'll have some time to answer questions at the end, and I really want this space today and for the following webinars in the series, for that space to be held for answering technical assistance questions or other issues that you as advocates and SANE nurses and all the other jobs that you do have encountered, that we can help workshop those together. So that's what the goal is. Let's just get started. So TAASA, hopefully you know us by now. We're the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault. There's our mission statement. Of course, we are the statewide coalition of rape crisis center advocates and survivors, and we are committed to fostering a culture that respects the fundamental rights and dignity of all Texans, including those Texans that are incarcerated in a correctional setting. So the program I work for, the Incarcerated Survivor Advocacy Program, we are a relatively new program. We've been around since October of 2016. So in our purpose is to offer support, advocacy, and resources to incarcerated survivors. But then we also provide training and technical assistance to rape crisis centers, correctional staff, advocates, and the public. And we really base our work in the belief that no one deserves to be raped regardless of what choices they've made in their lives, right? That we believe that all survivors of sexual assault or abuse deserve the same level of respect, compassion, and services as survivors in the community. So just to quickly go through, you may have seen this in your email already, but our goal of the webinar series is, of course, to acquaint advocates and other individuals with PREA basics and the basics on supporting incarcerated survivors here in Texas. And so we want to provide the knowledge and skills that you all need to support survivors in Texas. So this is just one way that we do this work. We provide information, we have provide access to resources, which I'll talk about resources on today's webinar and in future webinars, and then very targeted technical assistance for those of you that need it. And again, if you have questions or burning questions, or you've had an incident recently, or even, you know, not so recently, that you want to talk about, feel free to chat them into the chat box, and Wendy, my assistant here today, will be collecting all of that information, and we'll go over it together at the, there'll be some time at the end of the presentation. Okay, so very quickly, there's 3 parts. We're going to do some basic general information on the dynamics of sexual abuse and confinement, as well as a very introductory level introduction, if you will, to the PREA standards, with looking at relevant PREA standards to crisis service prevention. And then part 2 looks at promising practices on working with corrections staff on how to approach a correctional agency in order to enter into partnerships. We'll look at MOUs, which are Memorandum of Understandings, and other agreements, and how they can support your work to serve incarcerated survivors. And then the last one, part of the webinar series, explores creating a PREA project at your program, and then how to adapt services to a correctional setting. And at that webinar, we'll also look at materials and resources that TAASA has available and created for advocates working with PREA populations. So we're going to, again, this is a sort of a background introductory webinar. Some of this may be familiar to folks who have looked at materials around supporting incarcerated survivors before, but really we want this to be an introductory webinar series that really helps you understand the correctional landscape in the U.S. and Texas, learn and understand the rates of sexual abuse in detention and the dynamics that contribute to it, and then explain the importance of an advocate's role in incarcerated survivors' healing. So we know, you know, or many of you must or may be aware that, you know, the United States has quite a large correctional population. In fact, we represent only 25% of the world's population, but we represent a very small part of the world's population, fewer than 5%, but our incarcerated population makes up 25% of the entire world's correctional population. So we incarcerate a lot of people in the United States. And of course, you can see the statistic here that more than 2 million men, women, and children are incarcerated in the US, and that 5 million additional folks are on probation or parole. So just with those very large numbers, you can see that millions of individuals, including men, women, and children, have encountered the criminal justice system in some way. And that's just helpful to know as advocates as we, explore not only supporting incarcerated survivors specifically, but that you may have clients in the community who have been incarcerated or are currently on probation or parole, right? That you have that the reach of the criminal justice system is so great that countless individuals have been swept up into it, and that these individuals get out, re-enter communities, and hopefully don't reoffend, right? And are accessing services and things like that they need to address trauma. So just know that the population is very big, and that we're dealing with individuals who are incarcerated and then also coming out of a period of incarceration and returning to communities. So just quickly through this this pie chart, I just like a good pie chart. What can I say? This helps us sort of visualize where are these millions of people, or these hundreds of thousands of people, where are they primarily being housed or detained, right? And you can see from this pie chart that this is, of course, across the nation, but that state prisons are represent the vast majority of where incarcerated survivors and incarcerated people are held. The next largest is local jails, and then you've got federal facilities, youth facilities, immigration, and other facilities. But we're really looking at this vast amount of individuals who are in state prisons across the country. So the majority of incarcerated people are men, right? We have, especially in Texas, we have about 147,000 individuals who are incarcerated in a state prison facility. About 12,000 of those individuals are women. And so are cisgendered women, right, who are in facilities based on their gender. Now, men represent a very large portion of individuals, but I just want to throw a caveat out there that Texas does not incarcerate individuals based on their gender identity. They incarcerate people based on their genital status, and so there are trans women and gender nonconforming people who are kept in male facilities, and just wanted to make that very clear. But in general, the majority of people who are incarcerated are Black or Latino men. They're convicted of nonviolent crimes. They're parents of minor children, and they're facing mental health problems, including a history of childhood sexual abuse and other sexual traumas before incarceration. And so the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment, if you're extrapolating to pull out demographics, this is a helpful chart to kind of picture 1 in 9 of all men have a lifetime likelihood of being imprisoned. 1 in 17 men, so your chances are a little lower if you're white. If you're a Black male, it's 1 in 3. And so this really speaks to the institutional racism that exists in the criminal justice system, right, in our criminal legal system. That it's more likely that you'll be incarcerated if you're a Black male than if you are a white female, let's say. And so just to give some statistics on women, 1 in 56 of all women, 1 in 111 white women, 1 in 45 Latina women, and then 1 in 18 Black women. So those disparate statistics that you saw with Black males also applies to Black women. And of course, there's again speaks to the institutionalization of locking up brown and Black bodies for the last 50 to 60 years. So we see that in our correctional populations, and it's also good to be mindful that many of the individuals you may be working with as someone who supports supports incarcerated survivors may be a person of color. So that's just important as we explore culturally specific ways to support incarcerated populations. So moving along, I think we've drilled that pretty far home, but just another way to look at the data when we're looking at population by race and ethnicity. The U.S. population is, 63.7% white, but only represents 35%. The prison population is only represented by 35% white folks. And you can, of course, look at the other numbers and see that it's very disparate when it comes to Latino and Black populations. Okay, so let's talk about some of the settings that exist out there, because depending on where you are in the state of Texas, or if you're out of state, you may have a variety of correctional settings in your service area. And so this really important to know as advocates, and this is something TAASA can help you with, is to identify which facilities are in your service area specifically. Do you have a county jail in your area? Do you have a federal prison? Do you have a state prison? Do you have all of the above? It's just really important to know what sort of correctional settings are in your area, so you can adapt service delivery based on those facilities, right? So for instance, you may have a county jail in your area. You may have Fannin County Jail pictured here in your service area. But county jails are meant to hold individuals from a few hours to several years. They're not meant to hold individuals who are sentenced for long periods of time. In some cases, for shorter sentences or misdemeanors or lower level offenses, individuals can serve their sentence in a county jail setting, but for the most part, these are individuals who are not sentenced, who are, being held pre-trial, and are being, confined until their future can be determined, basically. And so, county jails can be tricky when you're trying to serve individuals in those facilities, because people can come into county jails and leave county jails very quickly, and it may not give you an opportunity to share resources or to provide further emotional support or follow-up and these kinds of things. Just be mindful of that as you work with people in county jails, that they may be there one moment and gone the next. So it's very important that, if you are seeing someone from the county jail, let's say at a local hospital for a SANE exam, that you give them follow-up information about your program, so that when they are back in the community, they can access your services. So just generally speaking, county jails restrict your movement, right? If you're incarcerated in a county jail, you can't come and go as you please. There's restrictions, and there's usually limited access to programming, right? So programming like vocational training or maybe GED classes and that kind of thing. It really just depends on the size of the county and what resources are available there. Now, prisons are a different thing. We in our modern, or in our vernacular, right? Our usual way of talking, society kind of uses prisons and jails interchangeably. In Texas, they're very different, and so I just wanted to make that clear that county jails are the one thing, the county jail where they're processing individuals who are going to be placed into prison settings, federal or state, later on, etc. And that prisons here in Texas are large, right? They're much larger than county jails, unless you count Harris County Jail, which is like the largest county jail in the country. But typically they're large, and then they're operated by state or federal agencies. So in Texas specifically, the state agency that runs the state prisons is the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, and you may have a state facility in your service area. Federal facilities are operated by the Bureau of Prisons, which is through the Department of Justice at the federal level. And these are facilities for inmates that are serving 2 or more years. The average sentence length in Texas for state facilities is 18 years. These prisons, these facilities have heavy surveillance. They have different custody levels for different individuals, and typically there's programming and employment programs and other opportunities for individuals to take part in, right? Whether it's a GED class or literacy programs or vocational training like welding, etc. Those are the kinds of things that may be available at state and federal facilities where people will be, incarcerated for longer periods of time. There's also community confinement facilities. These are kind of known, or mainly known as halfway houses, right? You have these, you'll want to know if you have these in your service area as well, because PREA also applies to any community confinement facility. And so community confinement facilities or halfway houses are for residents who pose little or no risk to the community, right? They're coming out of a period of incarceration into a community confinement setting where they are required to participate in employment or education efforts. These can be for people who are on parole or like I said, coming directly out of an incarceration setting or are on probation. So it's likely you may have a community confinement facility in your area and you just don't even know about it. But again, TAASA can help you identify these facilities in your service area if that's something that you'd like. Chances are you do have a community confinement facility in your area and you just don't know it. Okay, so juvenile facilities. Juvenile facilities are also protected by the Prison Rape Elimination Act standards. Now, they have their own standards for juvenile facilities, but you may have a juvenile facility in your service area, and these can be run by the state, they can be run by the county, and they can be contracted to private companies to run, which is not uncommon, of course. The difference between a juvenile facility and prison and jails we were talking about earlier is that the juvenile facilities and the juvenile justice system is rooted in a model that really focuses on rehabilitation and building life skills. It's seen as a second chance for youth. Now that's different because in our adult system, we really focus less on rehabilitation and more on punishment, right? Like the length of sentences and the laws that require you to spend a certain amount of time behind bars before being parole eligible, etc. With juvenile justice, it's just a little bit different in that, they're seen as children, and they are, who've made a mistake and can, with the proper intervention, can get the treatment and life skills they need to return to society and be, safe and happy community members. So you may have juvenile facilities in your area as well. You'll want to be aware of that. Immigration detention facilities, these are popping up more and more or every day, it seems. But these are facilities that are typically federally owned. They can also be local county jails that have contracts with ICE to hold individuals who are on an immigration detainer. They hold individuals who are being held before an administrative custody hearing or during and after removal proceedings. And the tricky thing with ICE facilities is that, length of stays can vary. You sometimes don't know. Your client may not know how long they're going to be there. The staff may have no idea how long they're going to be there. And it's very difficult, in my experience, to access survivors who are in this setting. And that's just something that I've noticed with my own advocacy, working with immigrants in detention facilities who have sexual assault allegations, that it's very difficult to access them and provide services. But I want you to be aware of them, of these facilities, because there could very well be some in your service area. Okay, so let's see here. Let's go into, I see Wendy's taking down questions. No? Okay, great. If you have questions, folks, please go ahead and chat them in the box, and then we'll collect them all at the end, and I'll go through them. So if you have a burning question, please type it in and we'll get to it. So I want to jump into rates of sexual assault in detention. And of course, this is helpful as you either begin your work or as a reminder about the scope of the work in serving incarcerated survivors. But approximately 200,000 adults are sexually abused behind bars every year in the US. And so that's quite a large number. If we're talking just specifically about Texas, the numbers are a little more difficult, or a little more nuanced, I'll say. So the last numbers that I looked at actually yesterday was about almost 5% of Texas prisoners across the whole system have reported being sexually assaulted while incarcerated in the previous 12 months of the survey. And so that works out to be about 7,000 individuals who are in state facilities, okay, that indicate they've been sexually abused behind bars. Then if you drill down a little further into that number, you can really look at rates of sexual abuse based on facility. And in Texas, we have some of the top most sexually violent facilities in the entire country, with one facility reporting up to 10% of individuals there being sexually assaulted. So it can vary by facility, and we'll talk a little bit more about that today and in later webinars. But as a whole, you're looking at 200,000 adults each year across the country, and about 7,000 individuals in Texas state prisons who report being sexually abused. And again, this is national data that you're seeing here, but 1 in 10 former adult state inmates reports being sexually abused while incarcerated. So, you're looking at that 10% number. And Texas ranks, among the highest in the nation. It's not to be proud of, but we are #1 in sexual assault and detention. So, the Bureau of Justice Statistics puts out this great, it's not great, but it's helpful information as advocates, right? Survey of sexual victimization for adults in the criminal justice system. And through that survey, we've been able to identify 5 facilities in Texas had more than double the national average of 4.9. So we had 5 facilities in Texas that had rates between 9.3% and 15.7% of Texas prisoners reported being sexually assaulted within the previous 12 months. So it's, we're looking at that 15.7% of a facility. That's extremely high number that should be concerning, right, to not only prison staff and agency staff, but to advocates as well. And so if you're an advocate in Texas and you're interested in knowing what facilities are in your area and what their rates of sexual abuse are, this is stuff that I research and keep track of. So please just email me and we can talk about that information and get that to you if that's helpful. So, when we're talking about rates of sexual abuse, you saw the earlier statistics about, 1 in 10 and then the Texas specific numbers. But really what what's consistently shown in these in the sexual victimization survey data is that sexual abuse is committed equally. It's about 46% and 46%. Doesn't equal 100, but there's a margin of error there. That equal rates of sexual abuse are committed by staff and other inmates, right? So that it's almost exactly half of these abuses are being committed by staff, which is alarming, very alarming. So that's sort of the background of the context of these are helpful numbers for you to remember as you start to think about, supporting incarcerated survivors. What is that going to look like for your program? What facilities are in my service area? These are all questions you want to start thinking about, whether you're already providing services or starting to do so in the future. So you guys are all experts. You guys are subject matter experts in this, and some of this will be review, but I do want to talk about the dynamics of sexual abuse and detention, because while they may be familiar to you, there may be some particular dynamics that relate to incarcerated survivors that might be helpful for you. So let's go through that. Sexual abuse and detention, no surprise, it's about power and control, right? It's about, exerting control over somebody else, their body, their mind, and having power over them. Sexual abuse in detention is part of the culture in many correctional facilities. It's sad but true, right? We have to address that as not only as advocates, but as a society, that we've embedded sexual abuse into prison culture in such a way that most people in the world believe that it is an inevitable part of being incarcerated, right? Like that, there's these jokes out there about, don't drop the soap, and, people making light about something extremely important and devastating. And we know that this culture that exists inside facilities gets brought back out into communities once individuals are released. So this is something we need to address together. And part of addressing that culture is to provide services to incarcerated survivors, right? It really does say something about that sort of pronounced public perception that people who are incarcerated deserve whatever sort of sexual abuse or other abuse happens to them. So we're all part of that, and we all need to challenge it. Sexual abuse in detention makes facilities unsafe, right? I mean, that should be a no-brainer, but if we're working together to end sexual abuse in detention, we are working together with correctional facilities and correctional staff to make facilities safer. We are here to do that together with them, right? And so it's such a, to me, it's such a no-brainer. Like, we all want safe facilities. We want people, no matter what, to be safe from sexual violence, regardless of where they are. And safety inside facilities is something you can return to and pivot back to when you need to connect with your local correctional agency, right? We're all in this to make the community safer and to make facilities safer. And lastly, sexual abuse, or not lastly, but on this slide, sexual abuse in detention is a combination of structural and interpersonal violence. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So structural violence, what is that? Well, it's when the rules, norms, or culture of an institution cause harm to people, including violations of human rights. So we see structural violence in a lot of different areas, not just in the correctional and legal system. We see it in the military, we see it in juvenile facilities, sometimes in institutions of higher learning, etc. So structural violence is embedded in the very fabric of detention facilities, right? It's shown in it reveals itself in the policies, the procedures, the budgets, the norms, the cultures that we talked about, and the systems of accountability. So structural violence, when we're talking about those policies, procedures, practices, etc., they create conditions that allow interpersonal violence to proliferate, right? So for example, correctional systems severely limit access to basic needs like toilet paper, sanitary napkins, soap, food, medications, communication with the outside world. Now, these are all things that are embedded in policies, procedures, and practices, but what it does is create a power imbalance whereby individuals who are able to access toilet paper, sanitary napkins, soap, food, medications, etc., are placed in a position of power that can lead to interpersonal violence, right? If you have a bunch of toilet paper, and if you have no toilet paper, let's say, but your cellmate does, and they give it to you, you created a little bit of a power dynamic here, whereby one person has power of the other by providing, basic necessities, and then usually requiring or wanting something in return, right? So structural violence, when we're talking about the culture of a facility and the policies and procedures of facilities, it really sends a message that prisoners are not worthy of basic dignity, right? That, these things are not deserved by individuals who have committed crimes and are incarcerated for committing crimes. It can also create an environment that abusive staff, and of course abusive inmates, right? Anybody can abuse these situations, that can be exploited by bringing in contraband like drugs, weapons, cell phones, and then permitting inmates to trade basic need items for money or other contraband, or forced sex. I mean, this is something that happens on a daily basis inside facilities. And so this is some structural violence, again, is something that we need to work together to dismantle. We're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like. But structural violence really creates the environment that allows interpersonal violence to proliferate. And so it shows here that the combination of that deprivation, right, the deprivation of having access to basic needs, and the market for contraband create unhealthy and dangerous imbalances of power. And we see this happen again and again with clients who come forward with allegations of sexual abuse. A lot of this is rooted in this dangerous imbalance of power. Data also shows that sexual abuse is more common in poorly run prisons that have higher rates of violence in general, who have issues with contraband, drug use, or other disorders. And so, if you're familiar with any of the issues that are happening with local correctional facilities in your service area, I think it's just helpful to know what's going on over there. If you see news stories about individuals being harmed, whether it's by other inmates or by staff, or if there's, excessive uses of force, or if you've seen news stories about contraband or cell phones or whatever, it's very likely that sexual abuse is also an issue that's going on in that facility. So how do we solve it? Oh, it's so simple, you guys. We just come up with some sound policies and procedures. I'm joking, of course. Solving structural violence involves a lot of work, but it's worth doing. And I think we're all in that work together, especially as members of the anti-sexual violence movement, right? It involves creating sound policies and procedures and putting them into practice. It involves proactive leadership who can acknowledge that there are improvements that could be made to their facilities or to agency culture or whatever. It involves having anti-bias and trauma-informed training for staff and inmates. It involves accountability for perpetrators, because guess what? That is not happening in our correctional system. While we see these extremely high rates of sexual abuse taking place in state and federal correctional facilities, we're not seeing, and it's the same for survivors in the community. We know this, that accountability for perpetrators is a fleeting and often difficult thing to achieve. But I've seen that even more so, play out even more so in a correctional setting, whereby, allegations made by incarcerated survivors are taken less seriously, are diminished, and are ultimately not prosecuted, right? And that really just sends a message to violent individuals who are incarcerated and harming people that their behavior is acceptable and can continue unchecked. And that's a really big problem. And then the last thing we can do to to solve structural violence is to address basic deprivation and provide basic necessities and living necessities for all individuals who are incarcerated. Okay, and so interpersonal violence, this is the the type of violence that we're probably most familiar with as sexual assault advocates. But interpersonal or direct violence occurs when one person exerts power and control over another person through physical, sexual, or emotional threats or actions, economic leverage, isolation, or other kinds of coercive behavior. And so just like in the community, sexual abuse and confinement exists on a continuum. And this is something that's really crucial to understand as you're serving incarcerated survivors, but also as you are working with correctional agency staff around ending sexual violence. This continuum is very important for them to know too, right? That it starts, it might start with unwanted sexually offensive jokes or words or gestures or other kinds of harassment. It can then lead to coercion, where one person feels pressured to engage in behavior that they otherwise wouldn't. which leads to threats of intimidation if sexual acts are not performed, touching, non-consensual sexual touching like groping, grabbing, and feeling, and then ultimately resulting in violence like sexual assault or rape. And this is, you know, over the time that I've been with TAASA, I've had over 150 clients contact us, and this is something, you know, that is extremely, you know, common in terms of individuals reporting escalating behaviors related to sexual abuse. And, you know, in most cases, it started out with words or threats or feeling pressured. And then when those incidences weren't taken seriously, it escalated into more sexually violent behavior. So very important for you as advocates to know this, which you already do, but to also then explain to correctional staff that that sexual abuse exists on a continuum. And so I'd like to pose this question. Of course, I said, you know, not to ask any questions, but this is just something to think about as advocates. And I always like to ask, like, what groups of inmates do you think are likely to be targeted for sexual abuse in detention? So you can put it in the chat box if you'd like to. You can also just kind of think about it or say it out loud wherever you are. If you're with a group, kind of talk about it. But we'll, of course, talk about it now. There are individuals who do have a higher risk of being sexually abused during incarceration. So individuals who have a history of sexual abuse in the community, right? Maybe they have a history of childhood sexual abuse, right? That's very commonly disclosed after I've worked with clients, incarcerated clients, or maybe they were previously incarcerated, either in a county jail or other facility, and were sexually assaulted during that incarceration, and now they're in a new serving a new sentence, right? But they're a previous survivor. So people who have suffered experienced abuse in the past, people with mental illnesses and developmental disabilities. These are individuals who are increasingly caught up in our criminal legal system anyway. And so you couple that with their vulnerability to sexual abuse and other kinds of coercion, and it does put them at a very clear risk. Lastly, and someone, Margie, thank you, typed it in correctly to the chat box about LGBT identifying individuals. Absolutely. This is probably the most common, client that we have. TAASA has more LGBT identifying clients than anything else when it comes to serving incarcerated survivors. So, as you might expect, trans women are being kept in men's facilities and being preyed upon in that way, and of course causes a lot of issues and difficulties for people who are gender nonconforming or who identify as LGBT, or even for people who are perceived to be LGBT, right? You don't even have to self-identify. If other people see you or view you as being LGBT, that can also put you at risk. So another question I like to pose to the group is, what do you think may prevent someone from reporting that they've been victimized in prison, right? Like, something's happened to them inside of a facility. They may or may not know about PREA and what rights they have around PREA. But there are factors certainly that prevent people from coming forward, just like there are factors in the community that prevent people from coming forward. And Curtis says fear of retaliation, distrust of the system, of course. Perpetrators, a staff member, oh my goodness, yes, fear. So let's see what you guys are all right, of course. 70% of individuals didn't want anyone to know about it, and from some perspective, I can completely relate to that. They didn't want anyone to know because it could put a target on their back, right? oh, I was sexually assaulted yesterday, someone else finds out about it, or other inmates or staff or whatever, you become a victim. And it's extremely risky to put yourself out there and admit that you are a victim. So 70% didn't want anyone to know. About 70% felt embarrassed or ashamed. 52% were afraid of the perpetrator. Of course, they're living with their perpetrator, right? This isn't someone they can get away from. And again, you can see that a lot of these are the same reasons people in the community don't come forward. 41% were afraid of being punished by staff. That's a very alarming statistic. And then 43% thought staff would not investigate, right? So that I can report, I can share my, go be vulnerable, share what happened to me, but inevitably, I don't believe that staff will investigate and I won't have a positive outcome of my report. So these are some of the reasons, according to that sexual victimization survey, of why people don't report. So, going back to just, some of the reasons inmates don't report abuse, I think, again, these are things that you've seen in the community, but there are some very different, there's different nuances to this, to serving incarcerated survivors who report. And someone in here in the chat box just chatted in something very helpful. Rebecca, of course, Rebecca Fears is amazing. Hi, Rebecca. So she's, and she's a sane nurse, and she says, I've seen multiple repeats after the first assault, then assaulted again the next day and told nobody believed you. They really won't, that last time they really won't believe you this time. Absolutely. This is something that I see just unfortunately so often in my work, where the victimization, the communication with clients really becomes ongoing support for repeat victimizations of the same individual. So for instance, a client comes forward to report sexual abuse, nothing is done about it, they're returned to their cell and raped again by their cellmate, and this goes on and on. And it's extremely difficult from an advocate's perspective, and we're going to talk about the importance of advocates, but it's very difficult from an advocate's perspective to do things like safety planning and coping ahead and other strategies to keep people safe, because fundamentally they're not safe inside these facilities unless there's some intervention that can take place. But unfortunately, we don't see that happening very often. Okay, so let's see here. Where am I? Oh, sorry, Wendy.
Don't apologize to me.
Let's see here. So I'm going to just, okay, I wanted to play a video and I'm not sure I'll get to just because of the technical issues we've been having. Okay, let's see. I don't think I got to put it in here. Okay.
Click on it.
All right, doesn't work. Okay, we're gonna just put it in the toolbar. All right, just bear with us 1 second here, you guys. And some of you may have seen this, and if you have, then you're going to see it again, but if you haven't, you're going to need some tissues.
There are quite a few different officers that an inmate has to check in with. And all those people, they all refer to me by my number. That advocate asked me what my name was. Because I'm not a thing. Because I'm a person. What's the name? And the first thing I did was, my name is Joe.
show was one of the first clients I had, and I was brand new, like sexual assault advocate. Most of my communication with incarcerated survivors was through letters, and I would read, these words, and
Yep,
the
I just put it in
feelings
chat.
that they were expressing weren't all that different than any other survivor that I had worked with. The self-blame, the shame, the fear, the trauma, all of that stuff just was very similar to everyone else that I had worked with. The big difference being that, their resources were so limited, and their ability to self-soothe and their ability to seek out appropriate support was almost nothing.
I went to a psychologist, and my plan is that no matter what, am I going back into that cell? Psych says, okay, we'll get you moved. So I leave the psych, and here come the cops. And he comes up to me, and he tells me, he says, all right, let's go. I said, where are we going? He said, back to your cell. Put me in waist chains, put me back in the cell. Nobody would let me out. I was on top of my bed. I was on the top of him. He grabbed my ankle. He pulled me off the bed and proceeded to rape me. And the second night he raped me. Third. And the fourth. Getting in contact with Jessica saved my life.
Some of the things that I would hear in the letters was just a lot of feeling isolated. And, with survivors who weren't incarcerated, they could just pick up the phone and call. We had a 24-hour crisis line. They could call whenever they, felt like it. But with the incarcerated survivors, their access to that communication was so limited. And so there was something really powerful and like tangible about getting a letter, and you could see how hard they wrote or what their handwriting looked like, and then being able to write back, it was kind of this opportunity to be very thoughtful in a way.
So what's the phone call? That was a turning point for me. As soon as she told me, I knew she'd been raped. I knew, without a doubt, and she could have never said another word to me. At that point, I knew that I hadn't done this. After this, all I had been treated like a number. And she has to be my name, and she touched my hand as a human being. And it really made a difference. My name is Joe.
Okay, y'all, I just wanted to check in with you all about that video from the wonderful Just Detention International, an organization based in Los Angeles. If you aren't familiar with their work, please, you know, find time to connect with advocates there. They'll also be a wonderful resource for you. But I think that you know, one of the reasons I play the video obviously is how powerful it is to hear from an incarcerated survivor who has gone through something so terrible, and really allowing them to explain how important it was to have an advocate on the outside, even if it was only through a letter, right? But that having a validating, having someone to validate their experience, who believes them, right? That is not something that the incarcerated survivors are typically getting. In fact, they're getting quite the opposite. You know, they aren't believed. Sometimes they're disciplined if you know, they find out that if they can't prove that the assault happened. And so advocates play a very special role in supporting incarcerated survivors when really there isn't any other support systems out there for them. So I wanted to just play that video, and if you haven't seen it before, you know, keep that one in your stash to show volunteers and other advocates and other staff members as you guys explore this work and expand this work to incarcerated survivors. So what's remarkable is that, you know, survivors in the community and survivors who are in confinement share a lot of common experiences. Like we saw with the reasons for not reporting. They deal with very few people believing them, if anyone, right? Even people that may be seen as, you know, helpful staff. So like maybe administrative staff or a caseworker or a social worker or a psychologist in the facility. They may not validate their experience as a victim either, even though that may be something they would do in the community. They experience that stigma of being a victim. And furthermore, the stigma of being a victim in a very closed, isolated, and confined setting where everybody knows your business, right? That's another fear of people just knowing what happened to you and knowing that nothing was done about it. Obviously, they experience trauma in both settings. But again, the lack of sufficient resources to deal with trauma in the confinement setting is really particularly important for us as advocates to know that, right? They are often blamed for their own abuse. I had one client who wrote to me and who was sexually assaulted by their cellmate several times, and told me that the correctional staff member that responded to their third allegation said that if they didn't have that kind of haircut, they wouldn't be raped all the time. So obviously blaming them for being sexually abused. And they also have to face their abuser daily, right? That, you know, prisons are big, but they're not that big. And you may be able to get moved to a different pod, or you may be able to get into different housing, but there's still the risk and the fear of facing your abuser, whether it's in the rec yard, at chow, in the day room, wherever, in the shower. I mean, there are interactions that happen daily with that could happen daily with your abuser or your abuser's friends, you know, or comrades or whatever, you know, the people that they associate with. So that's something that is a little bit different for incarcerated survivors, and that you just need to think about as you develop an advocacy strategy for incarcerated survivors. So let's see, we are getting some questions. I do want to leave time. So I'm going to skip to the next thing, and then we'll have about 25 minutes to answer some questions. Okay. So what does advocacy look like? You know, it can look like a lot of different things, and we're going to talk in the subsequent webinars about what advocacy looks like, whether it's individual advocacy and emotional support for incarcerated survivors, or if it's more high-level systems advocacy that improve the criminal and legal response to incarcerated survivors. There's plenty to be done in this area. And so advocates, as described by, I think beautifully by the My Name is Joe video, play a really major role in helping incarcerated survivors heal and cope from sexual trauma. And this population is the most desperate for services and the least served. So you're really looking at individuals who have, and this isn't just because they're incarcerated, but because of family histories, generational poverty, institutional racism, marginalization, on and on and on. We're talking about some of the most disenfranchised individuals in the entire country. Services may be difficult to initiate due to trust issues, right? Incarcerated individuals may not have never worked with sexual assault advocates from a program. They may think you're associated with the prison or the county jail, and not trust you, or think you're with CPS, whatever it is. You want to build trust with your client, and that can take time, because of course many survivors who are in these systems have a fear of trusting other agencies or organizations. And so we talk about that in the last webinar. We talk about that, about how to build trust with incarcerated survivors and how to position yourself to provide advocacy services in a meaningful way that that incarcerated people can relate to and feel good about doing, right? And then lastly, start by believing. I think we all try to start by believing, right? We're all advocates in this movement, and we have to believe them. And these are individuals who are used to not being believed. So even just saying, I believe you, what happened wasn't your fault, you didn't deserve it, things like that are validating. You may be the first person maybe in their lives to believe them about what's happened to them. So that's very important by clearly stating that you believe them and you are there to help support them through this. Okay, so you guys got a lot of information, some background information on correctional populations. You've chatted in some wonderful questions. I'm going to go ahead and get started on answering those. But as you're thinking about things and listening to some of the other questions, feel free to chat into the box. We may have time to get to those. If not, I will save them for the next webinar. So again, if you didn't catch that, if you want to chat in questions, I'll get to them on the next webinar. I'll leave some time, about 30 minutes, to do some technical assistance, some targeted technical assistance with folks that if they need it. And yes, this is recording. We will be sharing it on our YouTube, and that will be provided to you afterwards. Okay, so let's get started. I can't read Wendy's handwriting, so I'm going to go all the way up.
Okay, here we go. All right, let me read it for you.
Okay.
This is a question about access for NRSA for a recent incarcerated patient. Patient released this morning, assaulted while in jail. DPS site doesn't address where the assault occurred. What would you do?
Okay, that's a great question. And I am actually going to table that question for right this moment, because I think we probably, and I'm not sure whose question that was, but was that you, Rebecca? Rebecca, I'll call you. Not that I don't want to share that on the answer on the call on this webinar, but I wanted to kind of hit some of the other ones because I think they are less specific, but I do want to address that. And let me start here. Okay, so one question was, are they equal? We talked about rates of sexual assault by staff and inmates. So the statistic I gave you about the 50%, half and half, that is nationwide and Texas, right? So when we're looking at Texas specifically doesn't collect data around looking at rates of sexual assault between staff and other inmates, but they do provide a breakdown of all of the allegations each year, and it is about 50-50. At some facilities in Texas, staff abuse allegations are much higher than inmate abuse allegations, but that statistic is consistent across Texas.
Okay, the next one, is there a better way to screen staff for prisons to stop such a high rate of abuse happening?
Great question. So is there a better way to screen staff for who are coming to work at prisons for such a, to stop such a high rate of abuse? This is a great question. I'm not an expert in like hiring and HR and things like that, but what I would say is that in most cases, correctional facilities, certainly at the state level here in Texas, are understaffed and under-resourced, and really prison staff and correctional staff in general are underpaid for the work they do, right? They do very difficult work, very important work, and unfortunately they're not paid to the level that they should be, or treated in the way that they should be. And so I think we really are we're looking for folks to fill these shoes, to be boots on the ground, to protect, to make sure our facilities are safe, but we end up, when we're on a shortage and we're not screening appropriately, there are probably going to be a few bad apples in there as well. So I think my response to this, and this may not be what you want to hear, but is to pay, to reduce our reliance on incarceration. So let's put fewer people in prison, first of all. So we need fewer corrections officers, and let's pay corrections officers more and do more training and education with them so that they are able to perform their jobs in a healthy way. Okay. So next question, is there any data on survivors of sexual abuse while incarcerated also becoming perpetrators of abuse on others while incarcerated? That's a great question. So there is not a lot of research, and here's what gets tricky. There isn't a lot of research on the impacts of sexual victimization on incarcerated populations. Now, we know both anecdotally and statistically that individuals who experience sexual violence while incarcerated more than likely have also experienced sexual abuse in the community. So we know that. We also know that people who have been sexually abused or victimized in their lives often end up in an incarcerated setting, whether or not they're victimized in that setting. But there isn't very much data on whether individuals who are sexually abused while incarcerated then become perpetrators, whether perpetrators of abuse while they're still incarcerated or when they're released. But this would be a fantastic research project, and I would love to find some funding or a university or something to study this, because I think it's a really critical issue. The other data point that I would love to see is what's the data around recidivism, about people returning to prison or recommitting crimes after being sexually assaulted in prison and not getting the intervention or the help that they needed, right? Like, we know that that's happening again and again, and most often individuals aren't coming into their communities and accessing the local rape crisis center, possibly because they don't know about it, or possibly because they are not trying to address the trauma that they've experienced. But I'd also like to see a data set on that. So great question. Couple more. Okay, locally relocating to another pod means a move to a more restricted environment and you lose privileges. I've never felt it was done as a punitive measure. So the question there is, you know, when we're talking about ways to safety planning, or if, you know, if someone comes forward with allegations of abuse, being moved away, is that the question basically, Wendy?
Yeah,
okay.
That was my understanding, that if they're moved out of their pod, they go to another place more restricted.
Exactly.
Losing privilege, even though it's done for safety.
Right. So the idea being, of course, that, you know, this person is vulnerable to being sexually abused again. We have no safe place in the facility to place them, and so what ends up happening is they're moved to a restrictive environment, whether that's protective custody or solitary confinement or whatever, but that's that's their response to protecting them against further sexual abuse. Now, does it usually work against protecting them? Yeah, but what it ends up doing is putting them in a very restrictive and isolating environment after undergoing extraordinary trauma with no intervention or any emotional support, and they also lose privileges. So they may lose a privilege to use the telephone, or they may lose privileges to access reading materials or healing or journaling materials or other kinds of materials that can help them cope in the aftermath of trauma. So that is an issue that y'all should be aware of as advocates, that you may be assisting your client in getting moved to a different part of the prison, but hopefully not a less restrictive part of the prison, right? Okay. Okay, so I have a question about the staff seems to want to keep the person safe.
I think it's part of the other question.
Give action, but it comes at a cost. Yeah, that's a good question. So let's get to the question that Rebecca had about an individual who was recently released. It sounds like they were released this morning from a county jail. And honestly, my question from you, Rebecca, would be like, what are you trying to connect this individual to support services, or are you more interested in looking at a response to the allegation and how to move forward with an allegation or report of sexual abuse while they were in jail? But generally speaking, I would go to the local police department. So, you know, if they were abused in Harris County, you might get Houston PD involved with a report of sexual abuse that took place in the facility. But they're asking for a non-reporting sexual assault exam. Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, that's a great question. I'm gonna table that, Rebecca, and we're gonna talk about it later. But I do see some more questions that I want to get to before. So there were some really good resources mentioned on the chat box if you didn't have a chance to look at. The IRC Caring for Child Survivors of Sexual Abuse has multiple types of screening tools for workers that can be helpful. Yeah, and Rose had a really good point that, you know, individuals who go to work for a prison system or a correctional system, it can change you once you've been working in that system, right? I mean, you're doing extremely difficult work, not to mention the vicarious and secondary trauma that can happen by working in such an environment as a correctional setting, because of the violence that exists there. It's a very high stress. Correction staff also suffer from secondary and vicarious trauma, and it isn't really addressed within that community. So that's another barrier to providing these, survivor-centered and trauma-informed responses to incarcerated survivors. Yeah. Experiencing staffing concerns due to low pay. Absolutely. They have a difficult job and it's challenging to keep needed staffing levels. It's so true. It's an unfortunate reality that we face in Texas, especially. And I don't know if you guys have been following, but we have a pretty significant staff shortage at the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. So just these are the kinds of things you want to keep in mind as you start thinking about providing services to incarcerated survivors. Next one is going to be all about working with correctional staff, approaching them, establishing agreements, building rapport, and all that good stuff so that you can provide the best services possible to incarcerated survivors in your service area. Is this still the Rebecca Fears question?
No, this is Adriana.
Okay, let me go to her question. Would Travis County have jurisdiction when rape happens in jail? Travis County would have jurisdiction, and so would the Austin Police Department if you're talking about someone being sexually assaulted in the Travis County Correctional Complex in Del Valley or at the downtown lockup. So yes, and we've got some great for Rebecca, the person can go to Eloise's house and request a non-report sexual assault if they're in this area, I suppose. But you guys had some fantastic questions, and we were able to get to most of them today, but if you have more, you can always email me or chat it into the box and I'll get it down for our next webinar, which happens on next week. It's the 19th of March, same time. It'll be over the lunch hour, and we'll be talking again about working with correctional staff and how to build relationships there. And then on the 26th, our very last webinar, we'll talk about how to start or expand a PREA program in your area. So I really hope you guys can attend those two webinars coming up, and we'll have more resources to share with you at that time as well. So thank you all so very much for all your attention and your patience, and I really look forward to continuing this conversation about serving incarcerated survivors in Texas next week. Take care.
Just a housekeeping reminder, y'all.